Imagine you're driving down a lonely highway. Up ahead, you see a man dumping what looks like a body behind an abandoned building. A few minutes later, that same man is behind you, tailgating, swerving, trying to run you off the road. It sounds like the opening to a horror movie, and that's because it is. The terrifying chase that opens Jeepers Creepers was actually inspired by a real murder case, and the true story, the one Hollywood didn't tell you, is even darker. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into the horrifying true story that inspired Jeepers Creepers. While the film turned the killer into a supernatural monster, the real case involved a man named Dennis DePue, an ordinary husband who snapped, killed his wife, and then terrorized two innocent strangers on a Michigan highway. This story blends true crime and horror in a way that proves sometimes the scariest monsters aren't creatures, they're people. It was April 15th, 1990. Ray and Marie Thornton were driving through Coldwater, Michigan. Just a normal Sunday afternoon. The road was quiet, lined with farmland and scattered trees. As they approached an abandoned schoolhouse, Marie noticed something strange. A man standing by a large white van. He was dragging something heavy across the ground, something wrapped in a stained sheet. The man struggled, lifted it, and shoved it down into what looked like a drainage ditch. Marie turned to Ray and said, "That looked like a body." They slowed, looking back. The man paused mid-motion. He had seen them watching. Shaken, the Thorntons drove past the schoolhouse, debating whether to stop at the next phone and call police. But before they could decide, they saw something in the rearview mirror. Headlights, the same van. The driver was coming up fast, too fast. Within seconds, the van was right on their bumper, swerving aggressively, flashing its lights. The Thorntons were terrified. Marie told Ray, "He knows we saw him. He's trying to get us off the road." The van stayed glued to them for miles. Every time Ray sped up, the van matched. Every time he slowed, it lurched closer, threatening to ram them. For over 20 miles, the chase continued. An ordinary couple hunted across Michigan back roads by a man they believed had just murdered someone. Finally, the Thorntons spotted a state police station and pulled in. The van sped off into the night. Police took the report seriously. When officers investigated the abandoned school, they discovered the truth. The man was Dennis DePue, and what he had been dumping was the body of his wife, Marlene DePue. Dennis and Marlene's marriage had been falling apart for years. Friends said Dennis was controlling, angry, and increasingly unstable. On that April day, the couple argued inside their home until Dennis snapped. He beat Marlene brutally, shot her in the back of the head, and loaded her body into his van. When the Thorntons stumbled across him, he was trying to get rid of her. The chase wasn't random. Dennis knew that if those witnesses talked, his life was over. After dumping Marlene's body, Dennis fled. For weeks, he was on the run. Police issued nationwide bulletins, and his story was even featured on Unsolved Mysteries. But Dennis had no intention of being taken alive. In 1991, nearly a year later, police finally tracked him down in Mississippi. A high-speed chase ensued. When it became clear he couldn't escape, Dennis pulled out a gun and turned it on himself. The case was closed, but his legacy was just beginning. The strange thing about this case is not just the brutality of the murder, but how cinematic it felt. A couple sees something they shouldn't. A van hunts them down a lonely road. A faceless evil chasing innocence. When writer-director Victor Salva was developing Jeepers Creepers in the late 1990s, he came across the DePue case. He lifted the opening scenes almost exactly from Ray and Marie Thornton's account. In the film, the van becomes a rusted, terrifying truck. The killer is no longer human, but a winged monster that feeds on people. But the fear, the paranoia of being chased for what you saw, that came directly from reality. Jeepers Creepers may be remembered as a cult horror movie, but its roots are in a true crime story most people have never heard of. Ray and Marie Thornton thought they were just driving home that day. Instead, they became characters in a real-life horror movie, one that ended in murder, a manhunt, and eventually Hollywood legend. For Ray and Marie Thornton, that drive in April of 1990 was supposed to be forgettable, just two people heading home along a quiet Michigan back road, but instead, it became the one day they could never escape. They weren't investigators, they weren't thrill seekers, they weren't chasing danger. They were just an ordinary couple who, those terrifying miles, felt like they had stumbled into a horror movie. And in a way, they had. For the rest of their lives, they carried the memory of that van's headlights filling the rearview mirror. The way it loomed behind them, swerving, threatening, hunting them. Marie would later say that she could still see his eyes, cold, expressionless, staring at her through the windshield. Even after DePue's death, the fear never completely left them. They had looked directly into the face of a man who had just murdered his wife and who was willing to kill again, to cover it up. They were alive only because they had outrun him. A year later, when their story was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, millions of people across America saw what Ray and Marie had seen. Not the murder itself, but the terror of being pursued by something you couldn't explain, something you couldn't stop. And then, a decade later, Hollywood turned their story into fiction. When audiences sat down to watch Jeepers Creepers, they saw the same setup. A couple on a quiet drive, an abandoned building, a mysterious man with a van, and a chase that seemed impossible to escape. But there's one crucial difference. In the movie, the man becomes a supernatural monster. In real life, the monster was just a man, Dennis DePue. And that may be the most terrifying part of all, because movies give you the comfort of an ending. Credits roll, lights come up, the monster disappears. But for Ray and Marie, there was no ending. There was no escape from the memory of that day. They hadn't just witnessed a crime. They hadn't just survived a chase. They had lived through a nightmare that blurred the line between urban legend and reality. And unlike the movie, they didn't get to leave it behind when the screen went black. The truth behind Jeepers Creepers is simple. Sometimes, the most terrifying monsters aren't hiding under your bed or stalking the woods. Sometimes, they're right there on the highway, behind the wheel of a van. That was the horrifying true story behind Jeepers Creepers. But here's the thing. This isn't the only so-called urban legend with roots in reality. In fact, there are countless stories whispered in small towns, passed around like campfire tales. Stories most people dismiss as fiction. Until one day, the truth surfaces. If you found this story chilling, tap the like button. It really helps the channel. And if you want more true stories that blur the line between horror and reality, make sure you subscribe. In the next video, we're diving into another case that proves sometimes the scariest stories are the true ones. Click right here on screen, and I'll tell you all about it.